people. So, as I mentioned, there's a tree of life. Um, and in the tree of life, we've got prokaryotes, as I mentioned, which include bacteria and archaea. And then eukarya have nucleus and organelles. Okay. The thing is, if we again look at this cladogram, which shows evolutionary history, down here is old, and then at one point there was a common ancestor that split into two groups. One was bacteria, and the other was the line that led to archaea and eukarya. Now remember, eukaryotes have organelles. The thing is, it turns out archaea and eukarya are actually more closely related because they have a more recent common ancestor right here. So it looks like the eukaryotes were actually an offshoot of archaea. Okay, again, archaea and bacteria, they don't have any organelles. All they have is a cell with DNA, ribosomes, and the ability to make proteins. So off we go back to where we are, which is again, there was a problem with lecture capture. I'm really sick of this, but anyway, so I'm going to make a YouTube video. I'm going to start with cell structures. So we already viewed the animation, but you might want to go over it beforehand. Okay, so animal cells and plant cells, basically they're eukaryotes and they and fungi are the only multicellular eukaryotes. And eukaryotes all share certain things. They all have a nucleus. They all have mitochondria. They have endoplasmic reticulum, lysosomes, Golgi apparatus, ribosomes, all these things that are different compartments so that things can get done. And then there's some differences. Animals' cells don't have cell walls. Fungal cells and plant cells do. Also, plant cells have chloroplasts, so they're the only ones that can actually make glucose or other compounds, that high energy compounds, carbohydrates, compared to animals. So originally, I went back, just want to remember, again, animals and plant cells. First, we're just going to look at the general eukaryote here. Okay, so cell, and you can see that organelles, this is what, first of all, there's different kinds of organelles and other things that are in eukaryotic cells. There's a cytoskeleton that kind of is like the frame, the wooden frame on a house that you build onto. Endoplasmic reticulum, which is part of the process of making proteins. Golgi apparatus, still more part. Lysosomes that break things down. Mitochondria that are the energy producing structures in the cell that break down carbohydrates and turn it into ATP, and then a nucleus. Now, whereas everything happens in a prokaryotic cell inside the cell, it's different things are separated into different parts and happen in different parts of the structure. So separates different processes and chemical reactions into various organelles, okay? So on. It prevents material from mixing, so you can have reactions and things happening perhaps more efficiently, allows several reactions to happen at once. So for example, while the cell is starting the process of making a protein by reading the DNA and turning it into RNA and then turning it into protein in the cytoplasm, the mitochondria are busy making ATP. This increases a lot of efficiency, and it means that material can be moved between these organelles using vesicles. Now this, of course, if everything's happening at once in one place, you don't have to move things around, but it's actually, in some respects, easier. Okay, so here's the framework. First of all, there's a cytoskeleton, and it's basically a network of protein cylinders and filaments, microtubules, microfilaments, you can see right here. And it provides a structure like the frame of a house. And it organizes the interior of a cell. It supports intracellular movement of organelles. It enables a whole cell movement in some cell types. In other words, it actually allows cells to move. And it also gives shape to cells without cell walls. The cytoplasm is where everything happens inside the plasma membrane. So here's our plasma membrane right here. This is outside the cell. This is inside the cell. And the cytoplasm is a fluid kind of in here with all the different things. The nucleus is where all the molecules of inheritance, namely DNA, are held. They don't ever move out of that. The DNA is read and then actually goes from DNA is transcribed into another nucleic acid called RNA, which is single-stranded, as I showed here, versus double-stranded. And then that is then ferried out of the nucleus and into the cytoplasm to turn into protein. So to do that, the nucleus has all the chromosomes. It can make RNA, and then it's got a nuclear envelope. It's a double lipid bilayer like we've talked about before with the cell membrane bilayer. So it keeps certain things in and other things out, and it also has nuclear pores where certain things can leave, namely mRNA, which is the ribonucleic acid that has the instructions that I got from the DNA to make proteins. The ER is a lipid bilayer membrane again, and it's got two parts, smooth ER and rough ER. The smooth ER manufactures lipids and hormones and breaks down toxic compounds. So let's say there's some things like steroids, which are actually a combination of protein and fatty acid. They're put together in the rough ER. The protein that's part of that is made in the ribosomes from the rough ER, rough endoplasmic reticulum, and then it goes to the smooth ER where it gets bound, in this case, with lipids, and then it's sent off to the next stop, which is Golgi apparatus. So here we are. Okay, so this is let's see, this is ER, Golgi apparatus. Things that are transported from one to the other are transported in vesicles, kind of like, little things that are cut off from everything else, holding exactly what chemical they're supposed to. And then also, all these things that the cell is making, and it's also producing waste products, that has to be broken down. So that happens in lysosomes. And lysosomes are vesicles with all kinds of compounds that break things down. In other words, there's reactions that are catabolic reactions. And they break, let's say, proteins down into amino acids so they can be used again. They sometimes break other things down that can then be reused again, like simple sugars that can then be made into complex sugars, lipids, things like that. Okay, so here we are again. Again, I showed this. DNA is transcribed into RNA, mRNA, messenger RNA. Oh, come on. Okay, and remember, RNA is a single-stranded nucleic acid, but while DNA is double-stranded, and that comes out of the nuclear pore and goes into the rough ER, where it then hooks up with a ribosome, which then translates the instructions from the DNA using the RNA as a template into making a protein. So ribosomes make the protein. In the smooth ER, different things can happen to that protein. The proteins are then goes into vesicles where it's taken to the Golgi, and there other things are happening to the protein that give it its final form. And then either some of that protein will be used inside the cell for various things, whereas other parts like signaling proteins or hormones might leave the cell entirely through the plasma membrane. Okay. Now, finally, mitochondria. This is where something called cellular respiration happens, which we'll be talking about. And this is where all the glucose, essentially, is turned into a usable form, a high-energy molecule called ATP. So this is ATP. We'll learn about that in the next source. So essentially, mitochondria, this is where this happens. I mentioned earlier that the mitochondria have their own DNA, and it actually is very close in sequence to certain proteobacteria, which is interesting. So how did the mitochondria get into the eukaryotic cell? And it looks like it at one point was there was an archaeal cell that either engulfed or was invaded by a bacteria that took up shot. And instead of the archaeal cell digesting it, it didn't. And so the bacterial cell had a place to kind of hang out in safety. And in the meantime, these bacteria produce ATP using cellular respiration. So that source of ATP wasn't available beforehand, so now there's a real reliable source being made by the mitochondria. And so they're basically obligate symbiotes where they have to live inside the eukaryotic cell, and the eukaryotic cell gains a lot from having them, and namely all this ATP. So some cells like muscles need lots of energy, and so they have thousands and thousands of mitochondria, whereas others like fat cells don't have very many. So this is where cellular respiration takes place. Now, I mentioned that plant and animal cells, there's some differences. First of all, plants have a cell wall. Animal cells don't. They also have, instead of lysosomes, they don't have lysosomes, but they have these vacuoles that perform a number of different functions. Water storage, and then it turns out a lot of plants make very toxic compounds so that animals don't come along or other things and eat them. And so they sometimes store these in vacuoles, as well as enzymes that kind of break them down. And then, secondly, plants also have chloroplasts. Okay, and chloroplasts are what's necessary, taking the sun's energy and turning that with water into glucose and other carbohydrates. That's the only way you can get it, is through plants and photosynthetic bacteria, which we'll get to. So these chloroplasts are, they have chlorophyll in them. They're stacked in these thylakoid membranes. We'll learn about that. And that's where the reaction for photosynthesis takes place. Interesting, chloroplasts also have their own DNA. And it looks like it's another case again of a proto-eukaryotic cell that engulfed a cyanobacteria, not a proteo. Cyanobacteria are photosynthetic bacteria with chlorophyll. And then they took up residence inside plant cells, as well as green algae. And they also took up residence elsewhere in other kinds of algae, and became symbiotes as well. So this is where photosynthesis happens.